9,000 people fell silent when the undefeated champion of 12 years entered the dojo, certain that nothing could bring him down. He was bigger, stronger, and more respected than any opponent he had ever faced. But that night a different man appeared, one who didn't fight with brute strength, but with precision and calm. In less than 10 seconds, the unthinkable happened, and what followed left the entire arena in shock, wondering if they had just witnessed the end of an era. The air inside the Kuramae Kokugikan smelled of damp clay and the sweat of thousands of bouts that had marked the history of that sacred hall. 9,000 people filled every seat of Tokyo's Sumo Hall on an October afternoon in 1971. This wasn't a tournament, it was an extraordinary event, something the Japan Sumo Association had debated for 3 full weeks before authorizing it. A demonstration of cultural exchange, a meeting between Chinese martial arts and Japanese sumo, 2 different worlds forced to share the same sacred circle. The traditionalists had fought hard to prevent it, arguing that the dojo was inviolable, that foreign techniques should never cross its boundaries. The modernists, however, managed to prevail, though only by the slimmest margin. That decision hadn't closed the debate. It had simply moved it to the stage. Now 9,000 witnesses would decide, through their reactions and their memories, who had truly been right. Bruce Lee arrived at 7:15 in the evening through a side entrance that most visitors never even knew existed. He wore black training pants. He was barefoot and shirtless. He walked naturally, unhurried, accompanied by a translator keeping pace beside him, and a liaison from the organizing committee walking ahead of him with visible unease. At barely 1.70 meters tall and 61 kilograms, Bruce didn't look like a man about to challenge the oldest tradition in Japanese sport. At a glance, he could have been mistaken for an assistant, someone carrying equipment or setting up the stage, not the man about to step into one of the most revered spaces in Japanese culture. The liaison stopped right at the edge of the performance area and turned to face him. His expression could no longer hide his concern. He lowered his voice as if afraid the walls themselves might listen. "Mr. Lee," he said cautiously, "the wrestler they've chosen is Takamura." Bruce remained silent, waiting. "He's a yokozuna, undefeated for 12 years, the man continued, "very traditional, very proud." He paused briefly before adding in an even more tense tone, he might not cooperate. Bruce's expression didn't change. There was no surprise, no unease, no visible defiance in his face, only calm. "That's his choice," he replied evenly. The liaison nodded slowly and led him to a waiting area near the dojo. Bruce sat on a wooden bench, polished smooth by decades of use, worn down by the weight and discipline of countless wrestlers who had passed through before him. He didn't stretch, didn't rehearse any movements, showed no outward signs of preparation. He simply sat and breathed, back straight, gaze steady, watching as the crowd finished filling the arena. The sound of thousands of simultaneous conversations formed a wall of noise and invisible pressure that seemed to push against the walls of the hall. At 7:30, the eastern entrance opened. The crowd reacted immediately, rising as one body. The collective movement created a wave-like sensation, a vibration that swept through the hall from floor to ceiling. Then Takamura appeared. He wore the kesho mawashi, the ceremonial apron embroidered with his stable's emblem, a garment worth more than most men earned in several months of work. His body was the very embodiment of sumo, 204 kilograms distributed with precise logic, an architecture of strength built to dominate space. His legs looked like bridge pillars. His torso had the solidity of a barrel, and his arms were thick enough to crush ribs with a single blow. His traditional top knot was immaculate. His face was expressionless, carved into a rigid serenity that radiated authority and resolve. He climbed onto the dojo, and the platform creaked under his weight. He performed the ceremonial stomping ritual with solemn precision. Each foot rose slowly and came down with calculated force, symbolically driving out evil spirits from the ring. The sound echoed through the arena, deep and resonant, as if the earth itself were answering his presence. When the ritual ended, he stood motionless at the center of the circle and turned his gaze toward Bruce. He said nothing, but his eyes carried a clear, unmistakable message. "You don't belong here." The referee then stepped onto the doyo. He wore traditional black robes trimmed in gold. His face was carefully controlled, neutral, as befits someone whose duty is to observe without interfering, to judge without showing emotion. In the world of sumo, a referee doesn't represent an opinion. He represents the rule. With a firm gesture, he signaled Bruce to enter the ring. Bruce stood and walked barefoot toward the doyo. The clay was cold, slightly damp, and firm beneath his feet. He walked naturally to his position, without theatrics, without visible effort. The size difference between the two men drew gasps of astonishment from the spectators. At first glance, Takamura looked capable of destroying him with a single movement, as if he could simply fall on top of him. The referee began speaking in Japanese, explaining the rules of the demonstration in a clear, ceremonial tone. The translator leaned in slightly and repeated quietly to Bruce. Takamura would perform a ceremonial charge, and Bruce would demonstrate his ability to evade without full contact. No injuries, mutual respect between disciplines. When the explanation ended, the referee bowed solemnly to both men, sealing the beginning of a moment none of those present would ever forget. Bruce responded immediately with a deep bow, tilting his torso to a precise angle, close to 45 degrees. The movement was clean, deliberate, executed with an exactness that left no room for doubt. It wasn't an automatic gesture, it was a conscious act of acknowledgement. His hands lowered calmly, his shoulders relaxed, and his posture conveyed respect for the sacred ground he stood on and for the tradition that upheld it. There was no defiance in his gesture, no intent to provoke, only discipline, understanding, and a clear acceptance of the ritual. Takamura, by contrast, didn't move. He remained upright, motionless, arms crossed over his chest, watching Bruce with a cold, distant, almost contemptuous expression. His gaze held no curiosity, no courtesy. It was the look of a man who had already passed judgment and had no intention of reconsidering it. In that instant, the noise of the crowd died out as if someone had flipped an invisible switch. 9,000 people fell into absolute silence. In the world of sumo, refusing to return a bow wasn't simply bad manners. It was a formal statement. It meant the opponent was not worthy of respect, that his presence was considered an intrusion into sacred space, that tradition stood above any gesture of courtesy. The referee's face tensed almost imperceptibly. He approached Takamura and spoke quietly, with the discreet authority of someone trying to preserve order without provoking conflict. He asked him to reconsider, to complete the ritual, to uphold the dignity of the ceremony. Takamura listened without moving, without shifting his posture, and then shook his head once, a brief, final, irreversible gesture. Still, he did not bow. The referee then turned his gaze toward Bruce. For a moment, his eyes seemed to ask for forgiveness. Bruce slowly rose from his bow. His expression remained serene, unshaken, as if that gesture of contempt hadn't touched him at all. He watched Takamura for a few seconds with calm attention, no trace of anger or wounded pride. Then he nodded once, accepting the situation as it was, without resistance and without need for words. The referee stepped back and raised his hand. The signal. At that exact moment, Takamura dropped into his fighting stance. It wasn't the ceremonial position they had agreed on for a simple demonstration. It was a real combat stance, the explosive posture used in genuine bouts. The stance of a man unwilling to perform a show, but determined to impose his will. His center of gravity dropped, his muscles tensed, and his breathing turned short and powerful. The referee hesitated. He could stop this. He had the authority to. In fact, he should have. But 9,000 people were watching, and the weight of tradition, pride, and collective expectation had built to this instant. History was about to be written in front of everyone. The referee lowered his hand. Takamura exploded forward. The sound of his feet leaving the clay was sharp, violent, like a shotgun blast inside an enclosed space. 204 kilograms of muscle mass accelerating to full speed in under 2 meters. His hands shot out toward Bruce's torso, fingers spread, ready to grab, ready to shove, ready to expel him from the ring, out of the sacred circle, back to the foreign place his mind insisted he never should have left. First instant. Bruce shifted left by mere centimeters, a movement so small that most eyes couldn't register it. Takamura's right hand swept through empty space. His fingers closed on nothing. His eyes widened with a flash of confusion. Bruce was no longer where he should have been. Second instant. Takamura reacted quickly, adjusting his trajectory. His left hand swept through the air trying to catch him. His fingers brushed Bruce's shoulder, feeling the fleeting touch of fabric, but failing to grab hold. Bruce was already moving, flowing like someone who doesn't fight force, but lets it pass through. Third instant, Takamura planted his right foot with determination. His entire mass reorganized in a fraction of a second. His body spun with controlled violence, and his left hand shot forward in a palm strike aimed directly at Bruce's sternum. If that blow landed, ribs would break. The crowd leaned forward. The atmosphere shifted. This had stopped being a demonstration. Fourth instant. Bruce's right hand intercepted the strike, not with a rigid block, but with minimal, almost imperceptible contact. A gentle pressure applied to Takamura's wrist. There was no clash, no visible force, only redirection. The strike continued past Bruce's shoulder, and Takamura's own momentum began pulling him forward. His weight was already committed. Fifth instant. Bruce's left foot advanced and settled quietly behind Takamura's right ankle. A simple placement, silent, seemingly without tension. It wasn't an act of force. It was an act of precision. Sixth instant. Bruce's right hand moved to Takamura's shoulder. His fingertips made contact with an almost symbolic lightness, a directional touch, exact, as if pointing toward an invisible path. Takamura's body was already tilting forward. The fall had begun before anyone could even comprehend it. Seventh instant, Takamura's right foot moved forward searching for balance, but found Bruce's foot occupying the exact space he needed to plant on. His ankle caught. His stability vanished. Eighth instant, disconnection. His torso kept moving, driven by inertia. His locked legs stopped following. Coordination broke down. This was no longer a matter of will or strength. It was now simply physics. Ninth instant, Takamura fell. 204 kilograms struck the clay with a deep boom, like thunder rising from the ground itself. Dust rose in a thick cloud. The doyo shuddered under the impact, and for a second that seemed to last forever, time itself seemed to stop inside the Kuramai Kokugikan. Takamura lay on his back on the clay, breathing hard, eyes open, fixed on the ceiling of the hall from an angle he had never known before. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if his body needed to confirm it was still there, that the world still existed after that impact. For what felt like an eternal instant, time hung suspended around him. Then, in the 10th second, Bruce took a step back, naturally with no gesture of victory, no display of superiority. He stood there, breathing normally, calm, as if what had happened was simply the inevitable consequence of a correct movement. Takamura rose slowly. His hands left deep prints in the damp clay, visible marks of his weight and effort. 12 years. 12 years since the last time his back had touched the ground. 12 years building a reputation that had seemed unbreakable. He stood up with dignity, brushed the dust from his mawashi, and straightened his torso. His face was red, not only from physical exertion, but from inner turmoil. His hands trembled slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to reveal that something inside him had cracked. Silence dominated the hall. 9,000 people remained motionless, without a single sound. The referee too stood still, watching closely, aware that the moment had ceased to be a simple demonstration. Takamura looked up at Bruce. Something crossed his face. A complex emotion, hard to name. It wasn't respect, not yet. It was something rougher, denser, a mix of anger and confusion. He had felt the exact instant his ankle had been caught, the light touch on his shoulder, the way his own weight had been turned against him. He knew what had happened. He had experienced it with total clarity, but understanding it didn't make it acceptable. Then Takamura did something that startled the crowd even more than his fall. He returned to his fighting stance. Bruce immediately responded with a bow of equal depth, mirroring the gesture exactly, as if both men shared an ancient language that needed no words. Takamura straightened, turned with discipline, and walked to the edge of the dojo. He stepped down from the platform without looking back, without offering any explanation. His figure disappeared through the eastern entrance, his dignity intact, wrapped in silence. The crowd watched him leave with mixed emotions, confusion, disappointment, curiosity. Many expected an answer, some explanation of what had happened. But there was nothing, only the sound of his footsteps fading away. The referee then approached Bruce and spoke quietly. The translator relayed the message. "He says you should leave now, before this turns into something more." Bruce nodded without argument and stepped down from the dohyo naturally, as if following the suggestion was simply another part of the protocol. At that moment, the liaison reappeared backstage, visibly nervous. "This way," he said urgently. "Quickly." They left through the same side entrance Bruce had arrived through hours earlier. Behind them, the crowd's noise began to swell. Arguments, accusations, clashing opinions. Some claimed Bruce had used improper techniques. Others insisted Takamura had brought about his own defeat. The murmurs followed them down the hallways until they reached a secluded dressing room. The liaison shut the door quickly, and the noise faded to a distant echo. The translator broke the silence. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said quietly. Bruce bent down and began calmly wiping the clay dust from his feet, as if the simple gesture helped him settle the moment. He didn't answer, calm but present. The liaison's face was tense, anticipating consequences. "The association will be furious," he murmured. "There will be pressure." Bruce put on his shoes unhurried, adjusting every detail with the same attention he'd shown in the match. "That's not my concern," he said calmly. He stood up. The liaison led them to a back exit. The door opened, and the cold night air of Tokyo in October wrapped around them. The city continued its usual rhythm, unaware of the small earthquake that had just occurred inside the Kuramai Kokugikan. Years later, a sports journalist managed to track down 3 witnesses from that night. Each offered a different version of events, as if the same occurrence had been seen from opposing perspectives. One claimed Bruce Lee had defied Japanese tradition. Another argued that Takamura had been exposed, that his reputation depended more on custom than on adaptability. And a third, more reflective, said something that has echoed ever since, that both men had revealed a fundamental truth, that combat doesn't understand pride, only reality. Takamura never spoke publicly about that event. He continued competing for a few more years and retired from sumo in 1974. He later opened a restaurant in Osaka, living a quiet life far from the spotlight. When reporters asked him about that night, he always gave the same answer. "It was just a demonstration, and yet his students began to notice changes in how he taught. The emphasis on brute strength diminished. In its place came greater attention to anticipation, reading the opponent, and adaptation. He never spoke of that night, but his methods revealed that he had learned a profound lesson. Bruce Lee would die in 1973. The demonstration at the Kuramai Kokugikan was never mentioned in official interviews. But years later, among his belongings, a handwritten note was found. It was brief, direct. I fell tonight. Mastery is temporary. Understanding is permanent. Even in victory, remain a student. The lesson of that night was never really about who won. It was about what happens when certainty meets uncertainty, when tradition meets adaptation, when force meets understanding. Both men left that dohyo transformed. One learned humility. The other learned limits. And 9,000 people fell silent, not because they had witnessed a victory, but because they had witnessed the collision of two profound truths. After that encounter, neither man was ever the same again. If this story made you reflect, remember this. True strength doesn't always lie in size or reputation, but in the ability to adapt when everything changes. Because even the invincible can fall, and the wisest are those who learn from that moment.